Welcome to episode 15 of the Can I Tell You Something podcast. Today we have an episode about wizards. And you might be thinking, why are we talking about wizards? But I will intrigue you all with this thought. I have a feeling by the end of this episode, I could prove to all of you that wizards are real.
Okay, well,
Yeah. Did I just floor you? Was that quite the opener?
Here's the thing. This episode was inspired by these viral TikToks going around that I'm sure so many of you have seen. It's like me and the homies, going to raid the castle or whatever.
It's fetching rare herbs and
yeah, and it's just like picture or paintings of old wizards, and I just thought it was hilarious. And I think everyone has at least one special wizard in their life, whether it's Gandalf or
Dumbledore's another big one.
Dumbledore, rest in peace. There's a lot of video games, and everyone just knows wizard lore. But what we're curious about is where does the term wizard even come from? What does magic mean? How has that idea changed over time? And what does it mean now? Because I think we all kind of have that idea of, wizard has a pointy hat, long gray beard. But throughout history, that image has been very different. So as far as this episode, we will be going into just what are wizards, because we have to establish that first. Then we'll be going into the history and where wizards first came from, how have they changed throughout history, and then at the end, we'll be reconstructing the narrative of wizards and end with our classic debrief.
Yes, I think that a great way to wrap your mind around what's going on is ask yourself the question, before Gandalf, what were wizards? Because as inspirational as Gandalf is for the world of fantasy literature and media, something had to come before Gandalf, and something had to come before the things that came before Gandalf. These things don't just show up out of nowhere. A character like a wizard, an archetype like that, is actually quite a cultural, historical little artifact I've come to learn. So, without further ado, what are wizards?
Is that a question to me?
Yes, you are being questioned.
Okay, so just a precursor out there. I was not involved in the research of this episode, so I'm going in with just my assumptions that I've garnered throughout my life. And to answer the question, what are wizards? I would say wizards are a mythical, I don't want to say creature, but they're not human, a mythical character that harnesses magic for good.
Good old wise people.
Yeah, and very, very wise. And it might involve potions, or might involve spells, or I feel like they always have a staff, maybe a hat. Doesn't always have to be pointy, but I think they have to have some type of hat.
A fun hat.
A fun hat. Typically very, very old. That's why I said non-human, because I feel like they're several hundred years old.
Yeah.
That's where they get that wise perspective.
Yes.
That's what I would say. That's my final answer for what
That's
are
your
wizards.
final answer? I think that's more than acceptable. I would say something very similar. I would characterize them as old, but I think I have much more of the Harry Potter inspired perception of wizards.
You're thinking the young wizards.
Well, not just young, but they grow old, but they're not as potentially ancient as someone like Gandalf would be.
They don't come out of the womb at 200 years old.
Yeah, and they're not living for thousands of years.
So do you think they're human?
So I think that they're like an offshoot of human, like a special kind of group of humans.
So Homo sapien, Homo erectus, Homo wizardus.
Homo wizardus
is kind of what you're getting at.
Yeah, there is some sort of divine power that either they're born into or they acquired over time or something of the like, and that they are kind of more secluded from the rest of the world. And
I think that too, because, in the pop culture references we've already stated, Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings. Let's bring Wizards of Waverly Place into
Let's
this
bring them in there.
too. Like,
Yeah.
honorary mention. They are secluded, and there's some sort of protection or needing to be hidden for their safety. Kind of thing, like not allowing humans or letting humans know their powers or who they are.
And there's like an error of if humans figure out about who they are, what they can do, that they would co-opt that power for evil, or like there would be a corruptive tendency around it, or maybe an exploitive tendency around it. But yeah, so that was my perception of what wizards were before I started doing some of this research. But now we will get into where the term wizard comes from, what they even do, what is magic, like these sorts of things, because I came to realize quite quickly while doing this research that if you say wizards are magical, you first need to define what magic is. So this is kind of going to be more along the lines of this is like a history of what we call magic, but it has a lot of interplay with what wizards are as well. So they kind of have to work together.
Yeah, it seems like wizards are some sort of a Russian doll. It's like you can't really explain them without explaining something else. And to explain that, you have to explain something else in history. And I think that's really interesting when you're going back to a historical myth or something that has lasted the ages. It's going to go through changes. And I think it's really cool that this is something that's still very much alive in our culture today, I'd say throughout the world. And it seems like it maybe always has been, even if it just had another name.
Listen here,
folks.
We have a great podcast. At least we think so.
And we hope you do too.
But we are also the only two people on this podcast, so we could be a little delusional about this take.
And because of that, we're looking for viewers like you to tell it to us straight. Are we a good podcast or are we not?
We want to interact with you.
We want your opinion.
Your opinion.
You can find us at the Can I Tell You Something podcast on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube, where you'll hear us talk about things like, I don't know, do plants have feelings?
What is the Myers-Briggs personality test?
Who is Steve G?
And what do you think about the Barbie movie?
All that and more at the Can I Tell You Something podcast. So now that we have our wizardly assumptions, let's get into where the term wizard or sorcerer or magician even came up in history and how it was different in different cultures.
Yeah, so the term wizard comes from the term wise and man from Middle English. And it really came from a time before the Renaissance where people were seeking knowledge or seeking some sort of higher level of knowledge that was separate from what the church was able to provide. And so that's where you see things like astrology come into play. That's where you see things like alchemists come into play, is they were these bodies of knowledge that were independent of these churches. Now, within Celtic tradition, that sort of representation of a wizard was called a druid, and it was very similar to like a priest class. And those priests were known for training for a long period of time, probably getting very old, very wise, and providing clerical knowledge to the local governments, whether it was kings or other people in power. And they would do things like, I saw evidence of like human sacrifices. That's where that sort of stuff starts to come into play. And a lot of traditions like that.
So you're saying in Celtic tradition, they had quote unquote power.
Yes.
I'm saying like political power in a similar way that a priest might.
Yeah. So, as you can imagine then when Catholicism goes up north at that period of time, there was a lot of contention between what was considered occult and what was considered acceptable religion. That's where we get into the idea of magic or the occult coming into play as being the non-Christian, the accepted religion of that space.
So it's almost, I don't want to say counter movement because it's not a movement. It always existed, but maybe a counter lifestyle.
Yes.
Or way of thinking.
I mean, think about the way that we think of wizards kind of being off in the woods and being separate from society, cast out by society. That, I think, very much resembles what was being done with those ideas and beliefs. It's the idea that these are no longer acceptable. These are worshiping some sort of false god. There's a lot of, use of the Bible to say that this is false god, we're real God. And so...
Okay, so I think you did a great job of just kind of saying, this is the difference between magic and sorcery versus the church.
Yeah.
And here, like in Celtic tradition, this is what it's like. In the rest of Europe, this is what it was like. But do we know any information about the rest of the world? Because that's just Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know how other cultures were handling wizardry, or maybe different time periods? How did magic, or whatever the word was used at that time, influence ways of thinking back then? Because we're seeing a political impact.
Yeah. I want to say that the narrative that I'm presenting here is incredibly Western-centric. However, there is evidence that during the Renaissance, people were looking to old knowledge from other parts of the world as this kind of magical, mystical knowledge. I mean, and trying to derive some sense of wisdom from it. I think what's really interesting is we think of the Renaissance as the birth of scientific thought and of being very empirical and by the book. But there is great evidence that that period of time was actually much more exploratory in terms of where they were getting ideas, thoughts, and beliefs. And so something like magic being the other, magic equal to other, was much more accepted. And I'm of the opinion that when you see things that are older with newer eyes, or with the wisdom that we get over time throughout history, you can have some really kind of fascinating interpretations of what you're learning and what you're discovering. And it can lead to a lot of evolutions in thought. So it's interesting how it was first a part of the Renaissance, and then it was actually cast out by the Enlightenment movement, which is where we get into the idea of the classical period. And that's where we get into a lot of things like the witch trials being akin to like demonic ritual and all that sort of stuff.
Right. And that's the clear impact of the Catholic Church, is demonizing just the idea of magic and even gendering it, which, if anyone out there is even the slightest bit familiar with Salem witch trials or just witch trials throughout all of Europe, we know how just horrible that time period was, specifically for women who were not Catholic. But what I wanted to point out is it seems like the idea of magic is kind of being recycled as a thought throughout different thought movements, or whatever you want to call it. But the idea seems to be, like you said, exploratory in nature, maybe scientific. Humans just didn't have, and I don't want to say correct because we could be totally off today, but a more exact term for what changes they were seeing in the world before their eyes. So they gave it a general term like magic. This is something that is happening that we don't quite understand. It's outside of human ability. Therefore, it must have some sort of power source that we do not understand. And I just really like that. I think there's something so interesting about seeing things that you just can't quite understand. And I just think that the word magic is just a beautiful word to put to it. And it does make me sad that it has gone through so much turmoil to get to where it is today. But, if we're talking about wizards, we have to acknowledge what different time periods thought of it.
Yeah. And I do want to take it back to kind of our origins of where wizards came from to think about what it actually was to explore thoughts and ideas for some of the earliest people that could be classified as almost a wizard type. I would look towards astrology and alchemy as our kind of two foundational schools of thought. And you
Both science
both
that we would be today.
yeah, so it's like the equivalent is pretty, it's not one to one, but there's a lot of similarities. Astrology, I know, has a lot of different opinions today, but really where it was founded from was people looking up at the stars and trying to map their movements and relate it to social events that were happening on Earth. It was a way to try and understand what was going on in the cosmos and relate it to society. Where it enters that pseudoscientific space is a lot of the assumptions between those two spaces, movement of stars and people. But in the process of developing the field of astrology, there were incredibly precise calculations made of a lot of different stars. And that sort of basis was really helpful for founding things like astronomy, right? I mean, the words, they sound very similar for a reason.
Right.
And alchemy also has a really similar and fascinating origin. I'm sure that a lot of people are familiar with the concept of earth, water, fire, and air being the foundational elements of the universe.
Quick little side note.
Yes.
Do you remember that alchemy game? I used to play it in middle school. It was like a little browser game. Oh, I can't even remember. It might have just been called Alchemy.
Where you're just like making things?
Yeah, you have the elements and you have to combine them to make different things. I used to play that in our science class.
Yeah.
Let me know if anyone knows what I'm talking about.
I was finding that when I was doing
you
research.
Were, because that game was so fun. Please continue.
Yeah, so alchemy comes from the idea that you can create pretty much anything from these four foundational elements of earth, water, fire, and air. And the big sell of the time was being able to turn lead into gold. And so alchemists were hired by very powerful people at the time to help them make weapons, win wars, enhance things, because it was the idea that you could create anything from mixing different chemicals and all that jazz, which is true. Like, you can make anything through chemical processes. And what's interesting about how alchemy, as the pseudoscience bit, relates to chemistry today is that before alchemists existed, there were a limited number of earth materials that were readily available for people to use and explore using. But because alchemists started messing around with everything, all of these different acids and different powders and chemical compounds were being created almost by accident. So it was really the playing and the exploring and trying to figure things out that led to a broader foundation for chemistry to be built out of.
I was going to say, it sounds like alchemists and wizards of that time were chemists, physicists, astronomers,
mathematicians,
probably biologists if they were messing around with bugs and plants.
Well, a lot of the potions.
Doctors if they were healers.
Mm-hmm. And so there is initially the theory that chemistry comes out of health sciences, but it's likely that it actually came directly from alchemy. So when it comes to the way that scholars look at magic throughout history, they really split it up into two forms. One is low magic and the other is high magic or intellectual magic. And so low magic is much more of the small cultural artifacts. So that's charms, meaning prayers, blessings, or something of the sort, protective amulets, sorcery, popular astrology, trickery, and some medical magic through herbs and animals. Whereas high intellectual magic, which is much more in that alchemy space, includes more forms of learned magic. So that's where, alchemy, astrology, books of secrets, neuromancy. Neuromancy was a big thing. And the institution of high magic, I think, is where we get that wizard perception, whereas low magic is much more of the cultural bits. I think of
what do you mean institution of high magic?
So that would be your like druids and your priesthoods that are studying
Oh, okay. So
magic.
it's like an actual profession,
Yeah. Like,
quote unquote.
I mean, alchemists weren't coming out of nowhere. They had to study through something. And
Right.
then,
Whereas low magic, are you saying like anyone could do?
yeah, it would be anyone. It's, I mean, think of it as similar to the way that um, we have a lot of smaller religious artifacts. We have prayers that we say that, I mean, it seems very similar to that.
So just to
Yeah.
reiterate, low magic are everyday practices that people in a town or a community could practice either solo or together.
Mm-hmm.
High magic is something that a trained, I don't want to say professional because I don't know if that really,
professional.
I don't know if that really translates, but someone who is studying under a magic field does. So that's those traditional sciences that we know today. The chemists or the alchemists, the astrologers or the astronomers, and so forth.
Exactly. What's also interesting too is so we have the distinction between high and low magic, and then we also have the distinction between black and white magic too.
I was wondering when this was going to come into play.
Yeah, so black magic is much more of it was considered the demonic side of magic practitioners, which if we use some of this historical context, pretty much anything that's not Christian would be considered black magic.
And also just lots of racist undertones.
Yes.
Even just in the names.
And then white magic was another form of magic that was much more aligned, or it was compatible with Christian thought. It didn't dare fly in the face of it. It was it seems to be much, it leans into like the Holy Spirit side of Christianity a bit more in order to fit general Christian thought. And we see this sort of play out through a bunch of different cultures as they encounter Christianity, where it's not a clean, like Christianity takes over as the predominant religion. There are some concessions, there are some compromises made where multiple religions will kind of intersect and kind of augment from there. And so white magic, as I see it in this, is let's find a way to continue some sort of ritualistic practice that is similar, but make it acceptable by the church.
And the church is really good at that, at finding some practices or ideals that they know will either benefit them as an institution or is needed in their practice some way. So they're going to almost endorse a certain part of a practice and then demonize another and try and turn those individuals on one another so that they get more followers to the church. And, that's really tough because if any of you are familiar with white and black magic, specifically with different races and different groups of people, even here in the United States, you know how divided those groups are. And it's heartbreaking to know that this comes directly as a product from the church. But, there's nothing we can do about it now. The damage is done. But I did just want to point out, if there are any Outlander fans out there, such as myself, you will definitely know the difference between black and white magic in Scottish and Celtic culture. Mm-hmm. And that's just like one instance. I'm sure all of us have heard the term voodoo if you live in the United States and like have been to Louisiana or just know about it in the South in general. That's referred to as black magic, both like literally with the people who started it and practice it, but also just it was said that because the Catholic Church was so scared of it. And that also played like a huge role in the satanic panic in the United States and also the fear of the occult in the United States. And it's really unfortunate to see certain practices be associated with really harmful and violent ideals. when it seems like magic was once just magic. And since it's been split, I think that's fair. And like, since the church has split it, now there are different ideas and different interpretations.
I think that what's difficult to say is whether or not this sort of fracturing tends to just happen when a religion intersects with another. One is demonized and the other is not.
For example, like even science has been demonized by the Catholic Church. And of course it's getting better, but we know why certain things aren't taught in religious schools.
Yeah,
and like we've said, isn't magic just science and science is magic?
Yeah.
And of course, these are all my opinions. You're welcome to counter it.
Well, I mean, yeah, because you also have a good old history of scientists throughout history that have been either ostracized or like reprimanded by the church for scientific discovery. And then, you know, however many years later, it's like, oh yeah, they were right. Like Galileo's a big one in that.
And to me, like Galileo's a wizard.
Yeah,
hands down.
Like it's hard to
astronomer, wizard.
Yeah,
same thing. That's kind of what I'm getting at. Is like the basic idea that we can all relate magic to has split.
Yeah,
I think because of the church's intervention.
Can I Tell You Something is a Threads exclusive social media podcast. But you can also find us on TikTok and Instagram at Can I Tell You Something Podcast. And if you like listening with your ears to our wonderful voices, you can find more of us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. If you really love us, you'll stream us on all four. And if you don't...
simultaneously.
Yes.
So we've kind of hinted at it, but let's move towards what wizards might have looked like and changed throughout history. So my question to you is, when people would say that a miracle had been performed or some sort of magical ritual had been performed, what did that actually look like? Because, like we said, magic is such a blanket term that I feel like you can kind of fit a lot of ideas into. So do you have any like examples, or can you paint me a picture of what magic or the performance of magic may have looked like in different time periods?
I would say that the best way for us to wrap our heads around it is the performance of magic would be really similar to the performance of religion in a lot of ways, especially if we consider it as the othering of certain religions. So for Celtic Druids, for example, a lot of that was based off of sacrifice. And we know that other cultures throughout history have performed sacrifice in order to do things like, receive better rain, better conditions for crops, better food. It's the desire for a greater outcome. That's also where you get into it's almost like a delayed sense of goodwill. Stuff wouldn't happen instantaneously.
Meaning, like, you have to offer something or do something in order to get the desired outcome you want.
Yeah. I mean, it's like you have to have the recipe to get the outcome.
I'm surprised. I agree with that, but I'm surprised that you said that it would be similar to religion, because we've been talking about how magic was kind of the antithesis to religion.
I would say it's only the antithesis to a dominant religion. Because if we think about how pagan tradition has been co-opted by Christianity and the Catholic Church for kind of making the conversion pill easier to swallow for long practicing pagans, it would be strange to say that it is not akin to religion. Because if it's flying directly in the face of it, and if it is something that needs to be modified and eradicated in order to be replaced by another, then it must be very similar. The only examples I would say that would be different than that are when you're starting to deal with more like alchemist type characters where
Right.
you might have people that have highly specific specialized knowledge that not a lot of other people have. And that's where, this is where I would insert my opinion. If you have someone that's really knowledgeable about certain things and you're not, then their knowledge might seem quite magical, even though it is common for them or it is well known for them.
I always feel that when Neil deGrasse Tyson is speaking. I'll just say that, like,
right?
that man feels magical.
Yeah.
I guess a better follow-up question to you, because I agree in the way that you worded that.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you think the cliche wizarding practices came from? Like holding a wand, casting spells, mixing potions, even holding a staff. Like, we see these stereotypes and these cliches pop up in almost every wizarding reference. But how we're talking about it, it seems like they were just practicing natural sciences. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering where those stereotypes came from, or if they even existed, or is that just like an artistic assumption of what wizarding was?
So for the character Gandalf, who's based off of the Finnish demigod Vainamoinen is
very, very American pronunciation.
Yeah, is often characterized wielding a sword, but then also wielding a lyre or a harp made out of like an animal jawbone. So there are certain characterizations throughout history that I think modern day artists derive a lot of their inspiration off of. I didn't look into things like the staff and the wand stuff specifically because so much of the other history was, I thought, more important to kind of get to the bottom of and wrap my head around. But I wouldn't be surprised if, like, just a staff, if you think about wizards being old and wise, could just be a walking stick, And something as simple as a wand, I mean, when you are out in, let's say, the wilderness or in the outskirts of society, a good pointing stick is really good for drawing things in the dirt. It's really good. It's a easy to use tool. And it would also play into the stereotype of incredible age. Like wood can age for a very, very long time and have some sort of lively power to it. As for the potion stuff, though, I can speak more specifically to that.
Okay, real quick. Yeah. I just Googled this because wands, I had this question pop up. I'm like, okay, did J.K. Rowling invent wizarding wands? And then I was thinking, of course she didn't. There has to be a historical root in this. So I have a quick article from Just So You Know, Dumb Questions, Real Answers. Why do wizards have magic wands and staffs? And I am just going to read.
Oh, thank you.
Just
for saving me on this
quick excerpt. From Harry Potter receiving his first wand to Gandalf in the movies slyly telling a guard, "You wouldn't part an old man from his walking stick," we've accepted that wizards, witches, and fairies use wands and staffs to do their magical business. But where does that idea come from? Why are wands and staffs considered so magical? In short, there's a crazy long history of magic sticks. Unfortunately, it's impossible to pinpoint the exact place that this concept came from because there are so many historical incidents of people holding and using wands as staffs. Whether it was a pharaoh holding a staff, or a magi carrying a bundle of wands, or a Siberian shaman brandishing a wand for ritualistic drumming, many cultures all over the world have independently used sacred sticks for thousands of years. Like even in Greco-Roman mythology, staffs and wands were used. So now you know.
Now you know. I mean, it makes sense.
Wands are just magic sticks.
People love a good random stick.
I know I do.
Me too.
Even my dad collects little sticks and rocks in his bathroom.
It also plays a lot into the human tendency of we like tools and wielding tools and all that.
Right. And if wizarding started long, long ago, well, what tools did we have laying around? They were made of wood.
Lots of sticks.
We had lots of sticks.
And so I guess that makes a lot of sense. As for the potions and that sort of stuff, I mean, a lot of these rituals that would be practiced and be recreated over and over again involved recipes, often involving herbs and animal bits and all that sort of jazz.
that one I get is just chemistry.
Yeah.
Chemistry in a less intimidating environment. It's not your typical 7th or 8th grade chemistry classroom where your teacher's standing over your shoulder and you're making sure you don't burn things and pour the wrong chemicals into the wrong, what are they? What are those long
like
test tubes?
Test tubes. You know, I think
cylinders.
I think it was a bit more dangerous back then because they were just messing around with lead a lot of the time.
Yeah, someone had to
mercury.
find out that kills you.
Like they were using lead and mercury so much that it makes sense why there's this kind of mad scientist sort of feeling towards these
it really
old
makes
alchemists.
me wonder how wizards got so old if they're just messing around.
They're all 25 and just like really decrepit from lead poisoning.
Yeah. Okay, so I do have a last question before
Yes.
we get into reconstructing the narrative of wizards.
Yes.
If you were to magically be thrust into a world of wizarding, what would you want your powers to be? And powers in quotation marks, maybe your abilities to be, or your scientific inclination to be. Basically, what kind of wizard do you want to be? And I'm going to add one more thing to this. What do you want your tool to be? Because we talked a lot about like swords, staffs, wands, or you could make up your own. You could be a pioneer of a wizarding world. Paint me a picture of what you would like to be as a wizard, basically, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. I think for me, I would like my power to really be around invisible light, which I mean explicitly scientifically with that, because invisible light is everything from X-ray to ultraviolet to infrared to all that sort of stuff. But with invisible light, you can do everything from make Wi-Fi work, or you can heat up things from afar. Like infrared will heat up anything if you just point infrared light at it. Or, you know, X-ray, gamma radiation, like all these sorts of things. I think it would just be kind of cool to be just like light guy, but you don't really ever see the light, and then it just happens to work the way I expect it to work.
And what is your tool?
I think that I would probably have like a big old staff with like a magnifying glass on top of it.
Ooh.
In the shape of like an eye. Something cool like that.
Maybe a staff and it has a little button where the magnification glass can pop out the side.
Yeah.
Because you don't want that thing out all the time. What if you have to fight somebody, knock them in the head?
And then my glass breaks.
Exactly.
Yeah. Protective sheathed magnifying staff.
So you're going down the physics route.
Yeah. The light and optics guy.
Yeah, you're the light guy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go down the biology route, and stay with me because it might be a little bit of a stretch.
Okay.
But something that I've been so jealous of in like specifically Disney movies is the ability of the princess to be able to communicate with the animals. I like the only thing that I want to really, really do in my life every single day, my one desire is to be able to communicate with my pets and really any animal I come in contact with. So I know this is a little bit of a stretch for magic, but I would like to be the wizard who talks to animals.
Well, with what we know about us observing plant communication and all that, and like the random apps that are like, what is your cat saying to you?
It might be possible.
It might be possible.
At this point, it would be magic.
Yeah.
But in a couple generations, I don't know. So that's my desire. And I think my tool would be like a little perch that I have on my shoulder that whatever animal I'm speaking with, because I don't want other people around me to hear what they're saying. I
Yeah.
just want to be able to perch on my shoulder and whisper sweet nothings into my ear.
Are you inspired perhaps by the bird perch that I made the other night?
No,
Oh, okay.
I'm thinking larger perch.
My perch was pretty large.
Okay. But I am inspired for any Tolkien fans out there. I am inspired by Radagast because I think he's the coolest wizard in that universe. And he's just, he's all for the animals and wants to keep them all alive. And he's a little bit crazy, a little bit cuckoo.
That's the like the forest wizard.
Yeah, he's the one who is like on the little
Sled with the bunnies?
Yeah, with the bunnies.
Oh, yeah.
And to me, that is absolutely everything. So who knows?
Who knows?
If I wake up a wizard, that is what my specialty will be.
All right. You heard it here first, folks.
Now that we have a better idea of what wizards are, where they come from, and how the idea of magic and wizarding has changed throughout history, let's get into how wizards are depicted now.
So this question really comes from an article that I was reading in my research that talks about the difference in the way that men versus women are characterized when it comes to magic. And the article is titled White Wizard Male Privilege, Gendered Witchcraft, and Racialized Magic. It's a really interesting read.
It seems like it.
Yeah, it came from a Notre Dame professor, and it goes through a lot of media representation of wizards versus witches, and the way that certain similar abilities are considered scary and evil if it's a woman, or really helpful and almost like beloved if it's coming from a man.
Or
like,
wise,
saves the day. There's a lot of saving of people that comes from the male side of it.
heroic versus demonizing.
And if you wonder if this is like, oh, are we beyond this stereotype? Oh God, no, we are not. Like,
Not even close.
even after we have acknowledged the witch trials, even after that's been turned into plays, into different forms of media, it still is very much a constant with the way that wizards are portrayed versus witches. Because when I say the word witch, the first thing that I bet comes to most people's minds is not good. It's not a very positive thing.
For me, it's positive, but I think that this will be influenced specifically by like Hocus Pocus being a juicy film. But then also I've been a part of this subreddit for a while called Witches versus Patriarchy.
Oh, yeah.
And I just want to read the like description of this sub. It's Witches versus Patriarchy is a woman-centered sub with a witchy twist aimed at healing, supporting, and uplifting one another through humor and magic. The goal is to at once embrace and poke fun at the mystical aspects of femininity that have been previously demonized and or devalued by the patriarchy. And I think that's probably because I am a woman. I have never viewed and will never view witches as an evil or even scary idea. But I can see how any man, not saying you or not saying it's a bad thing, it's just in our culture today, I can see how a man may be more inclined to want to dress up as a wizard for Halloween as opposed for witches.
Yeah, I think it's even more explicit than that. Like they
I agree. I was just putting the Halloween thing out there because like the only other reference I really have for witches is Halloween costumes.
Yeah, I think that a lot of what I was realizing too was just how explicit that divide was. And really it was just like you flip the gender on this term that's supposed to be equal men to women and the cultural description is entirely different. And that says something.
I just have a question that popped up into my brain.
Yeah.
It seems like wizards are being used as the male equivalent to witches.
Yes.
Where do warlocks fit in on this? Because I thought a warlock was a male witch.
I think that yes.
Have they just been forgotten to history?
No, I think
Not
that,
an important character?
well, it's like, you have druids, sorcerers, warlock. Like there are so many different terms
Okay.
that it's impossible to just have one. Like that's where it gets really confusing when also doing research, because it's like, at this point, should we flip whether or not something is a wizard or a druid? Or is a druid really similar to a wizard, but not considered the same because they come from different times culturally?
So then why is witches the only word for women practicing magic? That's so upsetting that men are getting so many
Right?
different terms that we're getting confused by it, but then there's just only witch.
I can't tell if it's like a chicken versus the egg type thing, where the term witch was used, I think, to classify like an explicitly evil form of magic. Like there were books that were written.
But only women can be witches.
Exactly.
And so it's like, okay, so if a woman wants to practice magic, it must be black magic. It must be low magic.
Exactly.
Because she's a woman.
Well, I wouldn't say it's low magic. I would say it's high magic, but they add this idea of like deceptiveness, manipulation to it.
Oh.
What's interesting too is like the way that witches are characterized is that of like intense knowledge and power to manipulate. There is this idea that they almost are too smart and will always outwit your main characters and types of things. Like think about Hansel and Gretel.
I think that's a very generous interpretation from you. I think it's more fear-based.
It is fear.
This woman or this witch or being, I don't know if they even really are human technically, it is so evil that, she will kill you. She will cast a spell on you that will damn your future or things like that.
Yeah.
That it's very fear-based, whereas wizards is often welcoming or curious or intriguing or doing good for the world, whereas witches can only ever be evil.
I think that this is really well exemplified if you look at the way that Disney perpetuates this. In this article, they show 4 different witches. They show the Wicked Queen from Snow White, Maleficent from Sleeping Beauty, Ursula from The Little Mermaid, and Mother Gothel from Tangled. And just looking at the way that they're depicted, we'll throw an image on the screen. It says a lot about the way that witches are depicted in media. And then if we go to kind of what wizards tend to look like, we have 4 of them here. We have Merlin from The Sword of Stone. We have King Triton from The Little Mermaid. We have Jafar from Aladdin. And Dr. Falsier from The Princess and the Frog.
What's interesting from this, though, is, I've never thought of like Maleficent or Ursula as a witch. But I guess you're right. They technically would be. All 4 of those are the villains of their films. And then on the wizard side, only 2 of them are the villains. And the other 2 are good.
Which 2 are the villains?
The ones with dark skin, which that could be a whole other
a
whole other podcast. And I know a lot of you out there will be familiar with that analysis of Disney films.
Yes.
Would love to get into it, but don't have enough time here today. But that is really interesting that, these women, female depictions of magic are scary and evil.
Yeah.
And only 2 of them are in this example specifically. But if you just look at Disney films in general, the magic that's used is either coming from a princess. She finds out she has powers, and that's actually a good depiction, but they're never thought of as a witch. They're never called a witch, and those who are the villains.
Yeah. And so,
So
I mean, it's interesting to think about just what that word means. So that's kind of what I wanted to get into with defining witches and wizards within media and reconstructing what that actually means.
and what should they look like?
And yeah, and what should they look like? Because there is no reason except for cultural overtime or like misogynistic culturally that they should be different, because the defining characteristic between the two is male versus female, but the way that we represent them is almost polar opposite. I want to kind of throw this question to you. If we are to create more media that includes these enchanted characters, should the term witch even be used? How should people approach writing stories like this?
Definitely the term witch should be used. I think if we were to throw that term out altogether, it would somehow become more derogatory or worse than it actually is. But if we take that term and kind of re-empower it, and maybe you could like either super gender it or just take gender out of it altogether, then over time, I think we could see that witches wouldn't be so evil or wouldn't be so bad in media anymore. So if you were to write some sort of story with a witch or wizard character, I think that they would need to be almost interchangeable, because to me there should be no difference between the two. If they're practicing the same thing, magic, why is there a difference?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I am kind of right there with you with all of that. I almost feel like if the words get used more interchangeably, it would take the word and it would lift it up to how we perceive the word wizard.
And I think I have seen that, like I said, in that subreddit, witches
Yeah.
versus the patriarchy. I have seen evidence of the term witch being used to take back that power and being used alongside in feminism. And I think that's really cool, especially people who are more into Halloween or spooky season and just really identify with magic or spirituality in some way. It's a really good way to almost re-empower yourself as a woman interested in that field.
Yeah.
So I think that's really cool. So I think, it is changing, especially since, a couple decades ago when this was really, really demonized. I don't think it is anymore, at least in my world.
Yeah.
Of course, everyone's experience is vastly different, especially if you're coming from a hyper-religious background where things like this just aren't talked about. I mean, even some of these Disney movies we listed are on no watch lists. Like, a lot of people can't even watch Harry Potter because the church says you shouldn't. So it really just comes back to, what's your background? What's your relationship with magic? How do you define it? Do you think there is a difference between wizards and witches? If so, why?
Yeah.
I think everyone would have a different answer to that. But my answer is they should be interchangeable. But until they are, use witches as an empowering term.
Yes.
Because it should be.
Yeah. I think what's interesting to also add to this discussion is there's this connection between wizards and scholarship, right? We know that women are getting degrees or getting more degrees than men right now.
In the United States.
In the United States. And graduate degrees, the gender gap is still very much there. But at least for undergraduate, it is flipped around the other way. If wizard is a term that empowered men seeking wisdom and knowledge, then why can't witch be given some more of that energy when it comes to women? Like, the idea of being not only curious, but wise, intelligent, creative, cunning, like, those are all characteristics that you could easily describe with the term wizard. But I don't think people would think of those terms as often with the word witch. Now we're approaching Halloween, and I think it's a great time to reflect a little bit about what some of those legacies and scars of that misogyny historically, of some of these parts of our history that we know about, how can we kind of start righting the wrongs a little bit? And how can we actually not just right the wrongs, but use it as a springboard into a more beautiful and creative space? I mean, we were seeing that the Renaissance was embracing seeking knowledge that was considered outside of the mainstream.
But not from women.
But not from women.
We have to remember that women were left out of the Renaissance.
Yeah,
in
exactly.
That way.
And so it's like, if that is the perception there, like what does this new Renaissance look like? What does it look like to be more embracing and accepting of everyone? I mean, like, it is pretty plain to see that the greatest achievements that people do together are when they include each other. It happens over and over again in history. You include more people, guess what? People got some pretty cool things to offer. So, I don't know. With this whole episode, find a way to be excited about the term witch. Not let magic scare you, and to celebrate everyone that seeks knowledge and that is maybe a bit magical in your own eyes.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the sentiment of the episode. You know, I still find it fascinating to learn about the history of magic and wizards and witches, because we can't erase what happened. But it also shows you that the idea of magic is always changing.
Yeah.
We're not at our perfect point for that idea to just stop. And so when you see movements, especially including like feminist ideas surrounding the term of witch or magic, don't shine away from it. Like, investigate what's going on, because I think it is a really, really cool interpretation of feminism.
Yeah.
That is left out of the mainstream feminism narrative a lot, because people are still nervous about magic, and there are still, some bad undertones to it.
Yeah. I really liked how you connected the like witches against patriarchy.
Yes, I will link that below. I encourage everyone to at least go check out that sub, because it's just fun. The last thing I want to leave you all with is, it's so easy to think that magic just isn't real, because in our modern day, when we have so many scientific questions answered, it's easy to write off like, oh, that's not magic, that's chemistry. That's not magic, that's biology. Whatever you want to say. But I urge you all to keep asking questions that still aren't answered, and kind of wonder like, oh, like, are there some forces out there that might be responsible for this? Can that be magic? Like, it's okay, and it should be encouraged to wonder and believe in things that you don't fully understand, and then have the courage to go and pursue those things. Because without that, the field of science wouldn't exist. These things that we know today wouldn't exist. Like, the truths that we rely on as a society wouldn't have been here without these alchemists, without these wizards, without these witches. And so be thankful that they were curious, but also keep that tradition going. And like, if you have to look to the past to find some of that courage or some of that information to go forward, do. I believe in magic, and so should you.
I've said this to you a few times, but I feel like science often is just writing down the rules of magic. That's all it's doing. You're telling me that all that stuff isn't magical to some capacity? Like, come on.
Absolutely. Especially I think the more you specialize in one really, really small or specific part of science, the more someone can realize just how almost unexplainable certain phenomena are. And then that just loops you back to either magic or religion or spirituality. I think you can use a lot of those terms interchangeably based off of your own values. But yes, lots of takeaways from this episode. 1, be curious, believe in magic to a certain extent, of course, and support witches, support witchy feminism, do your own research.
Support your local witches.
You know what?
They're hard at work.
Support your local witches.
Yeah. I think that's all from me as well.
Okay, well, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Can I Tell You Something podcast. I hope you learned something. I know I definitely did. Hopefully after this episode, you can think about how to support those local witches.
Yes.
And wizards. Don't want to leave them out of the narrative.
I don't know. Wizards have had enough time on top.
They've had their time in the sun.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, with that, I think we will leave you all until next week. Make sure to let us know what you thought about this episode on our social media or down in the comments if you're on YouTube. We have Instagram and TikTok. It's at Can I Tell You Something? Something spelled SMTH.
Yes.
All right. Bye.
Bye.